Welcome back to the Old-Timey Workshop. I'm your host, Stumpy Nubs. In our last episode, which also happened to be our first episode, we made one of the most often reached for tools on the old-timey woodworker's bench, the marking knife. Now by now you've had time to become an expert knife maker, and your pencils have been relegated to doodling and sticking in your nose to scare small children. But don't you think it's time to give that new tool a break? I mean, a marking knife can't mark everything. Actually, it can mark anything, but it usually needs a little help from a tri-square, a straight edge, or a ruler, which is why old-timey woodworkers invented its cousin, the marking gauge. While the marking knife is king of marking lines perpendicular to an edge, the marking gauge kicks its regal rear end when you need a line parallel to the edge. The marking gauge isn't necessarily better than the marking knife. They're more of a team, like Bonnie and Clyde, or Boris and Natasha, or Bourbon and Mornings. If you're going to make the projects that we have in store in future episodes of this show, you're going to need at least 3 of these babies. I suppose if you already have some, it's a good idea to make some more anyway, because as you're going to see, having extra marking gauges around can be a huge benefit in projects. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to run over to the scrap bin, pick out some nice pieces of hardwood, and we'll light this candle. There are lots of ways to make marking gauges, and I've seen some really beautiful handmade versions on the woodworking forums. And since this is a tool you're going to use a lot, it makes sense to take your time and really make something you're proud of. On the other hand, since a really nice handmade tool requires a pretty high degree of precision to make, you almost need a marking gauge to make a marking gauge. It's kind of like that chicken and the egg thing. Thankfully, even a very basic marking gauge can be pretty accurate. So that's what we're going to make, something you can throw together with some simple tools in just a couple hours. I dug through my scrap bin and found some nice pieces of hardwood. I'm actually going to make 3 different kinds of marking gauges, and I'm going to use different species of wood so that I can tell them apart without going to the trouble of looking closely at them. I just haven't got that kind of time to be looking at things. Most gauges are made up of 2 pieces of wood. The fence, which is the square block of wood, and the whatchamacallit, which is the long narrow piece. I could tell you all the technical names for these parts, but I'm pretty sure an old-timey woodworker just called it a whatchamacallit. I ripped this nice and straight with a handsaw while you weren't looking, so now my board is about 2 inches wide. This isn't a critical measurement, and neither is the length, to tell you the truth. Bigger fences are sometimes easier to use, at least I think so, but smaller gauges are easier to stuff in a toolbox drawer. I'm making 2 that are 2 inches square and 1 that's 2 inches by 3 inches. You'll see why later. If you want them to be pretty, you can chamfer the edges, maybe do a little sanding, throw on a little finish. I mean, we want to make them quick, but we're not animals. Next come the whatchamacallits, or the poles, or the beams, or the sticks, or whatever you want to call them. You can make them square, which is easier to cut from square stock, but it will require a square mortise later on. Or you can make them from dowels, which are harder to make yourself, but you can slip them into round holes which are easier to bore. So it's a trade-off, unless you're rich and you can just throw money away on fancy store-bought dowels. I make them both because I just happen to have some spare dowels laying around on the floor that I swear I made myself. Now remember, we're making 3 different types of gauges. So just like I made 3 different fence blocks, I'm making a variety of beams. All are about the same length, 6 to 8 inches long. But I'm making 2 that are 3/4 in diameter and 2 that are 1/2 inch in diameter. I know, that's 4 and we only made 3 fence blocks. What the heck am I doing? Mystery must be killing you, eh? Maybe we should take a little break so we can get these numbers to add up. Pappy Nubs. He sure loved his marking gauges. We used to call him Pappy Marking Gauge Nubs. It's said that during the Great Depression, he supported the whole family with his marking gauge. He'd just go from town to town finding people that needed their boards marked and penny a scratch. You remember when I said you needed at least 3 gauges? Well, here's what I meant. This first one is simple. It's a single pin gauge, the most basic of the set. It's used for marking lines perpendicular to the edge or the face of a workpiece, making dovetails, raised panels, ripping and thicknessing boards. An old-timey woodworker used this gauge constantly. The second is a double pin mortising gauge. One pin is fixed in the end and the other is adjustable. You set the pins to the width of your mortise chisel and then you use it to lay out both the mortise and the tenon. Since mortise and tenon joinery is used in all sorts of woodworking projects, this is another essential tool. And the third is the cutting gauge. This is similar to the standard marking gauge, except instead of a pin, it has a stiff blade for slicing wood fibers. These are used in all sorts of things, from cutting veneers to severing the fibers across the grain of a workpiece before you use a plane to cut a rabbet. This one in particular is a double pole cutting gauge that's actually a little bit unique. Those are the three most important gauges, but Pappy had a few other ones too that are worth mentioning. This is a panel gauge, which is just a larger version of the regular single pin marking gauge. You don't see these a lot in modern workshops, but old-timey woodworkers used them all the time for a layout down the center of a wide board that you want to rip into narrower ones. This one's about 150 years old. These gauges, on the other hand, are more modern. They're standard marking gauges that have a round cutter on the end instead of a pin. Old-timey woodworkers would have loved to use these because they work much more smoothly, especially if you're transferring a line around the edge of the board. And the beveled cutter pulls the fence against the edge, reducing the gauge's tendency to wander. Pappy Nub sure loved his marking gauges, and who could blame him? These suckers are among the most versatile tools in any tool chest, not just the old-timey woodworker. So while you were lollygagging around Pappy Nub's tool chest, I was making some Thingamajigs for our marking gauges. You obviously don't have to make all these different kinds. You just have to decide if you want square or round. I went ahead and made both so you could see how they're done. I'm all about options, baby. The square ones are simple enough. These two gauges will get 3/4 inch beams, and this wider one will get 2 1/2 inch beams. The round ones are the same, except I planed flat sides on 2 1/2 inch round dowels. Now it's time to cut the mortises. If only I had a marking gauge to lay them out. If you're using round beams, you're all set. But for square ones, you have to chisel out some corners. It's always a good idea to chop halfway through one side and then flip it over and do the other half. And take your time. Don't try to knock this all out with one strike. You're gonna split these. In fact, you may even want to just lay them out on a full-size board, cut your mortises, and then cut your blocks to side. You'll be much less likely to split it out. The double beam gauge is a little bit different. You'll have to drill 2 holes side by side, which is pretty straightforward, but trickier with the round ones because the position of your holes depend on how much you've planed off the flat surfaces on your 1/2 inch dowels. It's much better to get the holes too close together than too far apart because you can always just plane a little more off the dowels until you get a better fit. What I did is just stuck my dowels on end right where I was going to want the holes to trace around them. And then I eyeballed where the center points would be, intentionally making them a little closer together than they should be. After I bore them out, I can plane down each dowel until I get a nice smooth fit. That's it for the wood parts. Sit back and congratulate yourself. Next comes the clamps and the pins. Let's just take a little break and check out some tips. You might think using a marking gauge is a simple thing. You just set it and scratch it. Us guy woodworkers know how to scratch, am I right? Up high. But some people have a hard time getting the hang of it at first, and while those people are fun to make fun of, there are a few tips that'll guarantee you're the one that's doing the mocking. The most common problem is when the pin follows the movement of the grain instead of making a crisp, straight line where you want it. The way to solve this is simple. First, start with the gauge turned so that the pin is up off the wood. As you start your stroke, you rotate the gauge so that the pin is dragging across the surface, kind of at an angle. Most of the pressure should be on the fence, keeping it tight up against the edge of the workpiece. You're not trying to gouge out a line in one stroke. Take a couple of light passes to make your mark. Another common problem people have is when their gauges go dull. You have to keep them sharp, just like any tool in the workshop. Touch up the pins with a file every now and then, and hone the blade and the cutting gauge just like you would a marking knife. It's also a good idea to have 1 or 2 extra marking gauges around. For example, if you're making a dovetailed chest, the thickness of your stock will be the same as the length of your dovetails. That same measurement may also be repeated elsewhere in the project. Or you may have a couple of different sizes of mortises repeated throughout the project. If you have an extra gauge or two that you can set to those dimensions and leave it there, that will save you a lot of time and minimize the mistakes throughout the project. Break's over. Time to make the metal parts. Here's where we're going to apply some modern solutions to our old-timey tools. Traditionally, you'd use a little wooden wedge to lock the fence in place. And if you want to do that, just make your mortises a little bit wider so there's room for that wedge. I'm not a big fan of tapping a wedge in order to tighten down the fence. I feel like it can move that fence out of place. And a lot of old-timey woodworkers must have agreed with me. So they started using wooden screws to tighten their gauges. If you have a wood thread kit, that's exactly what you should do. But most people don't. So we have to rely on some hardware store solutions. I'm going to use some 1/4-inch thumb screws and just tap right into the wood. Or you can even use some thread inserts. Now if you made your fence from some nice hardwood, you can tap those threads right in and they'll last a long time. Just drill your hole a couple, 30 seconds undersize, and you can even make yourself a tap out of an old bolt. This will last quite a while because you're not going to be torquing down on these gauges. But if you find that they do wear out over time, you can always drill your hole a little bit bigger and add some threaded inserts. The pins would traditionally have been made from some type of hardened steel, but a brad nail or finishing nail is a good solution for us today. Be sure though to drill a pilot hole slightly smaller than the size of the nail because you want it to fit in nice and tight and not back out, and you also don't want to split your wood when you pound it in. If you've been following along what I've been doing, you should have 3 different kinds of gauges. 2 single pole and 1 double pole. You want to stick a pin in the end of one of those single poles and in both of the poles in the double pole gauge. It's also a good idea to put your pins as close to the inner edges of that double pole gauge as you can so that it's easier to set your mortising chisel. The last gauge is a bit more difficult. This one gets a blade instead of a pin. Now, if you watched the last episode, you already know how to make a marking knife blade. It's kind of the same process for this. You just want a narrow blade, maybe like a 1/4-inch jigsaw blade. That would work out perfectly. You'd have to make a mortise in the end of your beam to hold the blade. So drill a hole about the same size, a 1/4 inch, and then square it off on the front end. It's a good idea to stay about a 1/2 inch back from the end of the pole so that you don't split it out when you drive your wedge in later. Now you've got to elongate that hole so that you can fit a wedge. And this requires a little bit of eyeball work. You want to step back about an 1/4 inch, maybe 3/8, and cut at an angle towards the bottom of that hole that you drilled so that you're only making the top of the hole wider. It's a good idea to just pare it away a little bit at a time. Take your time, that's what woodworking is all about, and then make a hardwood edge to fit into the tapered mortise so you can secure the blade with a tap and a nice friction fit. It requires a little bit of trial and error, but it's really not that big a deal to get the angles to match. Well, that's it for this episode of the Old-Timey Workshop. Now that we've made a couple of the most basic tools, we're going to move on to a build that's a little more complex. Next week, we're going to start on a saw bench and talk a little bit about the different kinds of saws that an old-timey woodworker would use. If you're a power tool guy, be sure to check out the Blue Collar Woodworking show over at stumpynubs.com. We're about to start a 2-episode series where we're talking about how to sharpen up your tools and save a bundle of cash. Till then, sit back, have yourself a cold one. Because old-timey woodworkers definitely earn it, my friend.